entering the world of the Old Testament, also known as the Hebrew Scriptures. This is the video piece to accompany the third session. The Old Testament is Israel's witness to its encounter with God, often called Yahweh. It is the story of God's action in their lives, what God has done, is doing, and will do. The Hebrew people understood their lives as the theater of God's activity, the wonderful work of a self-revealing God calling them to a new freedom. But what did this freedom look like? Where was it, and how do you get there? These and many more questions are answered in the Old Testament adventure of faith as the Israelite people lived in hope, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back in the long, slow, winding journey of conversion. Now, if you were to tell your faith story, where would you begin? Perhaps not with birth and childhood, but with a significant event or events deeply impressed on your memory that shaped your self-understanding. Likewise, Israel's story begins not with the time of Abraham or even creation, but with a crucial event of liberation. God marvelously bringing his people out of slavery in Egypt through the parting of the Red Sea. This was her true beginning, the time of her call and her creation as a people, giving her a common identity. This great Exodus story begins with a burning bush experience of Moses. I have seen the affliction of my people, God tells Moses, and I will come down to rescue them. And I am appointing you as leader of my people. Of course, we know of the hardening of the Pharaoh's heart and the many different plagues, but Pharaoh continued to resist. But then there was the 10th plague, the death of the Egyptian firstborn, both human and animal. The Israelites, however, were told to slaughter a lamb as a sacrifice to God and to put some of this lamb on the doorpost, and the angel of death would pass over them, and all their sons would be spared. This consecration of the firstborn, both man and beast, saved the Israelite people. Devastated by this final plague, Pharaoh finally relents and lets the people go. Moses gathers the Israelites for hasty departure from Egypt, taking only unleavened bread, which is a sign of new life in a land of promise. 600,000 men, as the story goes, adding women and children, more than 1 million. Setting out for the promised land, Israelites are led by God in the form of a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Pharaoh, however, has a change of heart, or God hardens his heart, and he pursues the escaping Hebrews. He sends out 600 chariots, which is about 1,800 men, in pursuit of his 1 million+ people. But pressed up against the waters of the Red Sea, and the 600 chariots bearing down on them, the Hebrews have second thoughts, complaining to Moses, better off in Egypt as slaves than dying in the desert. Moses asks the Lord for help. And the Lord says to Moses, well, lift up your staff, stretch it over the waters. As the pillar of flame holds back the Egyptians, a strong wind blows all night, and the next day the waters divide, allowing the Israelites to pass through with a wall of water to the left and a wall of water to the right. The Egyptians follow. The wheels of their chariots, however, get stuck in the mud, and the waters flow back, drowning the entire army. And we have a celebration. Sing to the Lord gloriously, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. This victory chant of Miriam is considered one of the oldest poetic verses in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, Jewish Midrash tells us that the angels in heaven were celebrating, and they asked God why he is not joining the festivities around the miraculous escape of his people. God is reported to have said, "The work of my hands is drowning in the sea, and you want me to celebrate?" Already there is mixed understanding about who is this God. With its melodramatic mix of history and mystery, memory and imagination and embellishment, the book of Exodus is the account of the Old Testament's foundational event, God's mighty act of deliverance and liberation. Earlier happenings and subsequent experiences are seen in the light of this great Exodus event. It made them a people and became their undying memory. I am the Lord, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. This event is celebrated yearly in Passover. Unless and until this story has been told, no other stories of the Israelites could have been told. And the content of Israel's faith centered in this great event of liberation and freedom. It is the story of salvation history. The word salvation means open wide. God opened wide the waters through the sea of chaos or the disturbances of human life, and God opened a way through the desert, the place of wilderness and suffering. But God was leading them to a promised land, the land of Canaan. Not really about real estate. It was much desert and occupied by other people. But this promised land was a relationship of learning to live in the love of the Lord. This relationship, as we shall see, is called covenant. I will be your God, and you will be my people. Come learn to live in my love. Exodus is also our story. We are a people called by God into a new freedom of living in God's love. Exodus is not simply one event in history. It is the dynamic of all history, the continual movement from bondage of hatred, violence, prejudice, abuse, and exclusion to a new freedom in God, the freedom of forgiveness, non-judgment, compassion, justice, and peace. But now, let us go for the rest of the story, all the peoples, places, and events that are part of the Israelite adventure as the people of God. It is all the time a faith testament, for Israelites saw their lives as a theater of God's activity. Brace yourself. There are many unnerving stories of violence, deceit, betrayal, and injustice, and idolatry. There are many suffering stories of loss and defeat. At the same time, there are compelling stories of forgiveness, repentance, courage, and conversion. The book of Genesis is really a prologue to the time when the curtain rises on the scene of oppression of Hebrews in Egypt. Israel recalls her origins, but always through the eyes of the Exodus story of liberation and being chosen as the people of God. The first 11 chapters of Genesis one might call prehistory. It is a story of growing alienation from oneself, from God, from others, from all people. God creates a beautiful world and puts Adam and Eve in this Garden of Eden. But evil enters and humans fall into sin, and intimacy with God is lost. Cain kills Abel, and brother is alienated from brother. People have become evil. The whole world is destroyed by water because of this evil, except for Noah, his family, and 2 of each living creature. And there's the great story of the rainbow covenant promise that God will never again destroy the world through water. And then there's the Tower of Babel, people striving to be like God, nations alienated from nations. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are creation to decreation, but God is the one who loves and wants to save. The rest of the story is God bringing all people back to the garden of intimacy, a relationship of love. We might call it recreation. And this begins with the patriarchs. They have some edges of history, but in many ways they are legendary accounts which set core themes for the entire scripture. Abraham and Sarah are called by God out of Ur, of the land of Chaldeans, to settle in a new place called Palestine. They are promised descendants in land. The only problem is Sarah is barren and tells Abraham to lay with his maidservant Hagar. And we have his oldest son born, Ishmael. Later, however, Sarah does become pregnant with the son Isaac in her old age. And then she banishes Hagar and Ishmael, but God cares for them. Abraham is called to sacrifice Isaac. God stops him. As we saw earlier, perhaps this is about the end of human sacrifice. And then we have Isaac and Rebekah, sons of Jacob and Esau. There is trickery and deceit. Jacob cheats Esau of his birthright. And then Jacob meets Rachel at the well, a place of romance in the Old Testament. And Laban tricks Jacob into marrying Leah. And only after 7 years does he receive as his wife Rachel, whom he loves dearly. And Jacob has 12 sons by 4 women. And these are the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph is the firstborn of Rachel and the favorite of his father. We know the story of the coat of many colors and Joseph as an interpreter of dreams. But his jealous brothers plan to kill Joseph. Instead, he is sold into slavery. And he arrives at the court of the Pharaoh, where he eventually becomes powerful through his ability to interpret dreams and tells them of the 7 years of famine. And during this time of famine, his family comes to Egypt seeking food. He tricks his family by putting a gold cup in the bag of Benjamin. And through this, there is reconciliation with Joseph and his brothers. And as the story ends, we have Joseph and his family living a life of comfort in Egypt, in the land of Goshen. You might wonder, why so much deceit and trickery? Yes, the book of Genesis is full of imperfect people, mistreatment and betrayal. But in each case, there is forgiveness. Even Jacob is reconciled with his brother Esau. And we saw how Ishmael and Isaac are reconciled at the burial of their father. And then Joseph reconciled with his brothers. God forgives, and we are called to forgiveness, a great theme of the Bible. The journey continues. When the book of Exodus opens, the Israelites are in Egypt, where famine has driven them. But over the course of years, about 400 years, kind of a hazy place in terms of historical awareness, over the course of the years, they suffer slavery and oppression. And then it is about 1300 BCE that we have the exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt, the great foundational story that I already described. They cross the Red Sea and escape Pharaoh's armies. God calls them as a community to be his people. And we know of the Ark of the Covenant, the 10 Commandments, the very basis of Israel's historical existence. Always a special relationship with Yahweh. I am the Lord your God, no other gods before me. Moses had a most difficult task as a spiritual and political leader of the people for 40 years wandering in the desert towards the promised land. Wandering in this time of formation as God's people. There was discontent and internal strife among the people. There is rebellion. And even though God provides manna and quail, they continued to complain. They fell into idolatry. And in a way, as a punishment, perhaps, no one, including Moses, entered the land of Canaan. It's hard to understand the punishment peep about Moses. Perhaps he already lived in the love of the Lord. Moses delivers a farewell address. I set before you life and death, blessing and curse. My dear people of God, choose life. And we begin a whole different period, the conquest of the Canaan land, of Canaan, or the Promised Land. And Joshua now becomes the new leader. He is a military leader with heavy responsibilities, called to lead the people across the Jordan River into the Promised Land and to conquer all obstacles on his path. Now, we hear that the Israelites, quote, conquer the land of Canaan. But how they do this is open to many interpretations, often focused on the city of Jericho, one of the oldest human settlements. They estimate about 8,000 BCE. Some say this victory happened with the mighty help of God the warrior who fought for them. Some say the Israelites marched around the city blowing ram's horns, and on the seventh day the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. Some say it was more intermarriage and a gradual takeover of the land. But as the Israelites settled in the new land of Canaan, it was the time of the judges. They formed a loosely knit confederation of 12 tribes called Israel, ruled by judges who were charismatic political and religious leaders. Two things seemed constant during this period of the judges. The 12 tribes fell into idolatry, worshipped pagan gods, especially Baal, the goddess of fertility. They did what was evil in God's sight. And as a result of this, the way they understood it, tribes preyed upon them. They were preyed upon by stronger neighbors. And the Israelites saw this as a cycle of being raided and invaded as God's way of punishing them. And the judges always came to the rescue, to get Israel out of one jam after another, to whip them into shape, reestablish order, and the people prayed and repented. There was one female judge named Deborah, about 1100 BCE. She was a bold and forceful leader, a heroic warrior woman, almost like a contemporary Jewish Joan of Arc, who saved her people from a Canaanite enemy. With the help of Jael, you might have heard the story, who drives a tent stake through the sleeping General Sisera's temple, they are victorious. A couple other very famous judges are Samson, with his physical strength, and the secret was his hair, but he was really a bad boy of Israel. And then there is Samuel, the son of Deborah, the last and greatest of the judges. Interspersed in this story of the judges is an interesting tale, perhaps, of Naomi and Ruth. It is a beautiful story of friendship between mother and daughter, but it is really a story about much more. In the time of the judges, intermarriage was sometimes cursed. The Bible's response to this exclusion approach was really the story of Ruth and Naomi, because Ruth was a Moabite woman who marries King Boaz, who is Jewish. And in the genealogy of Matthew's gospel, Ruth is named as an ancestor to David, or great-grandmother. And you can see this is breaking through the idea of intermarriage is good. We are chosen, but not only us, we are for all people. The period of Judges comes to a close with the threat of the Philistines and the beginning of the kingdom. The anxious people beg Samuel for a king like other nations. Samuel resists. They already have a king in God. Keep God's law and you will be safe. But the people persist. They need a king to fend off the pesky neighbors, to form an army for security, and to fight the enemy. Samuel assures them that they will regret this, but he relents and appoints Saul as Israel's first king. Now, we move then to the time of the monarchy and the united kingdom called Israel, with Jerusalem as its capital. This is about 1010 to 930 BCE. Saul as Israel's first king. like I said, chosen by Samuel, was a tragic figure. He was a war hero and a noble character with a fatal flaw. And this fatal flaw was a lack of leadership. He failed ultimately to defeat the Philistines, and he failed also to establish the rule over the tribal confederation. And he lost favor with the Lord because he did not kill the king Abimelech. He was also insanely jealous of David and sought twice to murder him. David was saved by his wife Michal, who was actually the daughter of Saul. And he was saved again by his dear friend Jonathan, who is the son of Saul. Saul's own family was choosing David over him. And as Saul lost favor, Samuel was out looking for a new king, and he went to the house of Jesse, and he chose David, the youngest of the sons and the least likely candidate, because Samuel knew that the Spirit of the Lord fell upon him. Now David was a popular and charismatic king. His reign began about 1000 BCE and lasted for 30 years. He chose Jerusalem as a capital, strategically located. His rule is now known as the golden age of peace, culture, and prosperity. He enriched the spiritual life of the people. He's credited with writing many of the Psalms. And he became the hope of the Messiah, the line of David. However, too often power corrupts. He also became a sinner, he is a complex character who became an adulterous murderer. Perhaps you know the story. He lay with a beautiful woman, Bathsheba. She became pregnant. David tries to trick Uriah, her husband, into having intercourse so he can hide what he has done. But Uriah refuses to do this because intercourse before battle weakens a soldier. So David sends Uriah to the front line, and he is killed. The prophet Nathan tells David of the doom to his family. David repents, weeps, wears sackcloth and ashes. But ultimately, 3 of his sons are killed during his lifetime. It's like brother killing brother in the struggle for the throne. However, one of his sons, Samuel, becomes the next king, and the last of the kings. Now Samuel, raised in 970 BCE, raises Israel to the period of the greatest prominence in the Mediterranean world. He builds and builds and builds palaces, an extravagant temple in Jerusalem, and even shrines to the pagan gods. But this building was at great cost to his subjects through excessive taxation and even forced labor. Later in life, wisdom legends about Solomon. You know the story of the women sparring over the baby, and Solomon, in his wisdom, tells them to cut it in half, and the true mother, of course, screams, and Solomon knows who is the real mother of the baby. There are also proverbs attributed to him. And perhaps Solomon was a wise man, but later in life, he was not very smart. He had 600 concubines, built pagan shrines, turned to idolatry, and imposed ever-increasing taxes on his people. Upon the death of Solomon, people in the north approach his son King Rehoboam and beg him to reduce taxes. He consults with his advisors. No way, he says, it would be a sign of weakness. Arguably, the worst advice given in the Bible. Arrogantly, Rehoboam refuses, saying, "You haven't seen anything yet," and he increases taxes instead. And this is the end of the United Kingdom, as the 12 tribes in the north say, "We don't need this," and they secede and establish their own kingdom. And 930 BCE, we have the divided kingdom. The northern kingdom, Israel, with Samaria as its capital, 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital, 2 tribes. They lived in a strained relationship for 200 years, separated by the city of Jerusalem. And during this time, we have the ministry of the earliest prophet Elijah, though he did not write a book. King Ahab's wife Jezebel promoted idolatry, cultic prostitution, and worship at pagan shrines. Elijah struggled to bring people back to the Yahweh fold. He was also a wonder worker, raising children from the dead. But he set up a contest with 400 prophets of Baal. Through cultic trances, dancing, and fire offerings, they tried to raise their God from the dead, but unsuccessful. Elijah mocked them. Only Yahweh is real, he says. Only Yahweh is powerful. Your gods are worthless. We continue the time of prophets. In the northern kingdom, there were prophets of Amos and Hosea, about 830 to 730 BCE. Amos and Hosea warned against infidelity to the covenant, against the worship of idols, injustice to the poor and widow, the violence of war, and they warned against false worship, but it was not heeded by the people. And God punished them. In 722, Samaria and the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians, who now were the dominating power in the known world. Many of its citizens were deported and became the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Eventually, these 10 tribes were absorbed by other nations, even as other captured peoples were brought to Israel. And this intermarriage resulted in a mixed population called Samaritans. The southern kingdom of Judah survived for another 150 years. And they had their own prophets with the same warnings as Amos and Hosea, such prophets as 1st Isaiah, Micah, and Jeremiah. And then there were also the efforts of the good King Josiah, who tried to reform the people through what he called the discovery of ancient Bible scrolls, to bring them back to faithfulness. But it was not enough. In 587, the southern kingdom of Judah fell to Babylon. And many of the people, especially the wealthy and the educated, were exiled to Babylon. And there was a destruction of the first Jewish temple which had been built by King Solomon. And King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon routed the southern kingdom and took the Jewish people into exile. Actually, there were 2 exiles, one in 597 and one in 587. But 587 ended the kingdom of Judah. Now, we know that the prophets were people of fire and brimstone, but there were also prophets during the Babylonian exile from 587 to 538 BCE. These were a source of hope and compassion for a despondent people feeling lost in the land of Babylon. Such prophets as Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and 2nd Isaiah carried the people during this time of suffering. A new power comes on the stage of the world, and this power is King Cyrus the Great of Persia. He ends the Jewish exile in 538 BCE, and we enter the post-exilic period of the Israelite people. They return to Jerusalem and begin rebuilding the homeland. The tribal identities are actually blurred by now, and they simply become known as the Jews. They are no longer a political nation, but a religious community under the high priest and scribes. During this time, we also have prophets calling the people back to faithfulness, to remember who they are as a people of God. Such prophets as Isaiah, 3rd Isaiah, the prophet of peace. And there are also the prophets of Zechariah and Haggai, who encourage rebuilding the temple. And in 516 BCE, there is a dedication of the second temple, rebuilt, of course, after exile. There was another voice that was especially important in rebuilding after the tragedy of exile, or two voices, Ezra the scribe and Nehemiah, a Persian governor. They help maintain Jewish identity during difficult time of restoration. They bring together the great oral traditions of Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomy, and priestly, which have begun to take shape before exile and especially during exile. And he ultimately puts together these traditions to form the first 5 books of the Bible and call people to covenant love. Now, we say that the Pentateuch is completed in its present form by Ezra and, well, especially Ezra the scribe. And some people ask, well, was the Pentateuch written by Moses? At some level, yes, we can say. He remains the spiritual guide and the representative of God through this entire book of law. And during this time also, wisdom writings begin to take shape, especially in the light of exile experience. So often, suffering takes us deeper into the mystery of God. Again, a new power is on the stage. And this time it is the Greeks. In 333 BCE, Alexander the Great takes over the world. And during this Hellenistic world domination, he captures Jerusalem, but he does allow the Jews to practice religion. He attempts to Hellenize his entire empire and impose Greek culture, religion, language, and literature. It is a somewhat peaceful time for the Jewish people. However, upon the death of Alexander the Great, the Syrian Solutions ruled Jerusalem for about 150 years, and they tax the Jews heavily. One of these Syrian Solutions in 167 to 164 was a cruel despot. He persecuted the Jews and desecrated the temple. It was during this time that the book of Daniel, the prophet, was written as a source of hope to the people in these times of great suffering and rejection. And finally, they decided, enough is enough. And in 164 BCE, there was a Maccabean revolt against Antiochus IV. And to the amazement of all, they were victorious. Judea becomes once again an independent kingdom under the Hasmonean dynasty. The desecrated temple is rededicated. We know this as the Feast of Hanukkah. But there is a power struggle between the newly formed religious sects, Pharisees, Essenes, Sadducees, Zealots. And the religious powers seek help from Rome, who comes in like a bemused lion and in a bloodless takeover assumes control of Jerusalem. In 63 BCE, the Romans have achieved world domination when Pompey conquers Judea. And we've heard in 37 to 4 BCE, as we enter the time of Christ in this great story, Herod the Great, an Idumean Jew, becomes king of Judea. There is once again reconstruction of the temple, and Herod is a shrewd manager of the Jewish people. But upon his death, the kingdom is divided among 3 sons, Judea, Galilee, and Samaria. Herod Antipas is in Galilee, and another son is exiled because of his cruelty and incompetency. He's replaced by a Roman prefect in 6 CE. This prefect, named Pontius Pilate, ruled Judea and Samaria at the time of Jesus, 26 to 36 CE, or Common Era, also known as AD. And it is around 4 AD that Jesus of Nazareth is born. In all of this great story, God of the Jewish people was a God of history, gradually revealing God's self in the life experiences of God's people, both personal and communal. Exodus and exile, victory and defeat, suffering and loss. But the Jewish people interpreted this entire journey as the work of God in their midst, for they saw their lives as the theater of God's activity. It was all a conversion journey as they slowly came to understand who is God and how are they called to live as the people of God. It is a journey of deeper trust and increasing comprehension, not unlike a magic carpet ride where God continues to pull out the threads of the carpet and ask us to simply trust and continue the journey with God.